Rick Warren hasn't been the same since the most devastating tragedy of his life on April 5, 2013. And now it seems things may only get harder for him. What happened to his family became a lifelong mission. And it showed how even the strongest faith can't shield someone from grief that refuses to fade. Before that grief broke him, most people didn't realize he had already been broken once in front of the entire country. Long before he lost his son, Rick Warren had experienced public pain back in 2006. When Saddleback Church was growing rapidly, his name became a lightning rod. His success made him famous, but also made him a target. The purpose-driven church model he developed created widespread debate, and the consequences were far more severe than he ever imagined. Churches across the country split as they tried to follow his strategies, congregations dividing, people being pushed out, friendships ending in arguments in parking lots over worship styles and seating arrangements. Rick hated seeing that. He begged pastors not to force anything, not to expel people, not to treat church growth like a war. But it happened anyway. And every time a church fell apart using his methods, he felt the weight of responsibility. He carried both the knowledge that he'd helped thousands thrive and the guilt that others had been torn apart trying to apply his ideas. Then came another storm. In 2008, after Barack Obama won the presidency, he invited Rick to deliver the inaugural prayer. What should have been an honor became a national controversy. Critics resurfaced a letter he'd written to his congregation explaining his belief that the Bible defined marriage as between a man and a woman. And suddenly, Rick Warren found himself accused of hate speech. Headlines exploded, protests formed, and people demanded he be removed from the inauguration. The irony was that only months earlier he had been hugging HIV patients, working with gay men and women in his church's AIDS ministry, telling reporters he had real friendships in the LGBTQ community. None of that mattered once the narrative was set. Obama defended him, saying disagreement wasn't hatred, and that Rick had welcomed him at Saddleback, even when they disagreed. But the backlash still hit hard. What made it worse was that while one side attacked him for being too conservative, the other side, many fellow evangelicals, attacked him for not being conservative enough. They said he wasn't harsh enough, not militant enough, not angry enough. Rick wondered how fighting people was supposed to bring them closer to Jesus. No matter what he said, he upset someone. No matter what he did, someone called him a coward. The criticism didn't stop. In 2009, and again in 2012, some evangelical leaders accused him of compromising his faith because he met with Muslims, ate meals with imams, and attended interfaith conferences focused on peace and poverty. He believed being a friend to all was part of following Jesus, but even that brought accusations of betrayal. Every time he tried to build a bridge, someone claimed he was burning one. He grew used to the controversy, waking up and discovering that strangers had decided who he was and what he stood for. But none of that prepared him for what came next. His son Matthew was only 7 when doctors diagnosed him with clinical depression, something Rick and Kay could hardly comprehend. How could a child so young carry such deep darkness? But the signs had been there almost from the start. Something in his brilliant, sensitive mind made the world feel harsher and heavier than it should. Matthew was the kind of child who could walk into a room and immediately find the person who was suffering, because he recognized in others the pain he lived with himself. Friends remembered him going straight to whoever seemed uncomfortable or lonely, guided by an almost uncanny radar for human hurt. The heartbreaking irony was that the boy who sensed everyone's pain was drowning in his own. Rick described his son as kind, gentle, compassionate, an intelligent young man whose sweet spirit comforted many people. But behind closed doors, the family lived a very different reality. They endured endless doctor appointments, medications that never worked, and therapy sessions that felt like throwing stones into a bottomless sea. Year after year, they watched Matthew struggle with depression that swallowed him whole, with panic attacks that struck without warning, with mood swings that rearranged his personality. They tried everything: top doctors, advanced treatments, counseling, prayers from thousands of people who didn't even know his name. They kept his illness private, not out of shame, but because it was his story to tell, his dignity to protect. And all the while, Rick and Kay were trying to navigate life as globally known church leaders while raising a son who sometimes asked why he couldn't just die. When Matthew was 17, he sat across from his father and said something that would stay with Rick Warren for the rest of his life. He told him it was painfully clear he wasn't going to get better. They had gone to the best doctors in the country. He had taken the best medications. They had tried every treatment anyone suggested, and none of it had brought relief. So Matthew asked the question no parent should ever hear, why couldn't he just die and go to heaven? Rick told him he couldn't give up. As a father, he had to believe there was still an answer somewhere, some treatment they hadn't tried yet. Some breakthrough just ahead. Matthew lived another 10 years after that conversation. 10 years of trying, of holding on, of waking up each morning with the same relentless pain wrapped around his mind like barbed wire. But Rick sensed something he could never quite bring himself to say aloud. Call it instinct. Call it a father's fear. He knew there would come a day when Matthew's pain might become unbearable. That knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold every single day. On April 5th, the family had a fun evening together. That's what made everything so devastating. They laughed, talked, and enjoyed each other's company. Everything seemed normal. Matthew seemed normal. But depression can disguise itself. It whispers lies, tells you there is no relief, no hope, no way forward, in what Rick later described as a momentary wave of despair. Matthew returned to his home in Mission Viejo. Sometime around 10 a.m. that Friday morning, he made a decision that shattered his family. He ended his life. The call came that afternoon. Matthew had been found in his home. The gun he used had its serial number scratched off, an unregistered weapon he had purchased illegally online, slipping past California's strict background checks and regulations. Later, Rick would publicly forgive the person who had sold the gun, quoting scripture about forgiveness. But on that day, none of that mattered. There was no theology, no purpose, only a father who had to identify his son's body. Within 30 minutes, Rick and Kay's small group arrived. They didn't pause to call or text. They simply came. They wrapped their arms around the Warrens and stayed. Rick later said that the deeper the pain, the fewer words you need. That night, their small group slept wherever they could in couches. On the kitchen floor, refusing to leave the family alone. The next day, Rick wrote to his congregation. After more than 3 decades of being their pastor, standing with them at gravesides and holding their hands through every crisis imaginable, he told them the truth. Their youngest son, Matthew, 27 years old, and a lifelong member of Saddleback, had died. He wrote about Matthew's kindness and brilliant mind, but also about how mental illness had tormented him despite the best doctors, the best treatments, and countless prayers. News outlets seized on the story immediately. The pastor, who had guided millions toward purpose, had lost his own son to suicide. And some people couldn't resist pointing out the irony. Critics questioned his faith, and cruelly, some suggested it was judgment. Rick tried to ignore the noise, but grieving in public is entirely different from grieving in private. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, wanted to analyze his pain, interpret it, use it for their own arguments. Meanwhile, he and Kay had to face practical decisions. No building in Orange County was large enough to hold all the people who wanted to attend the funeral. They chose a private memorial for family only, asking others to honor Matthew by donating to the mental health fund created in his name. Donations poured in by the thousands. Rick didn't preach for 4 months. 16 weeks of silence. He stepped away from the pulpit, let others fill in, and spent his days alone with Kay and with God. He later said that spending that much time in deep conversation with God changes you, and it did. When he returned in late July, it was clear he wasn't the same man. He felt people's pain more deeply. He cried more easily. He didn't just sympathize anymore, he empathized, because now he knew what it meant to bury a child. His first sermon back focused on dealing with hardship, a topic chosen before Matthew's death in what felt like a heartbreaking twist of timing. Rick spoke about grief as the painful but necessary passage through loss. He cried on stage. Kay stood beside him, wiping tears from his face. She told the congregation that Matthew's body had been broken by the gun, but that he would be raised in glory. She spoke of missing him and of the broken heart she would carry for the rest of her life. And then she said something that stopped the room. "It's possible," she told them, "to walk through life with tears in your eyes and a smile on your face at the same time." That moment marked the beginning of something bigger. Saddleback launched a mental health initiative, conferences, workshops, support groups. Rick partnered with the Catholic Diocese of Orange with mental health organizations, with psychiatrists, counselors, and anyone willing to listen. It became a mission born from pain, a way to bring help to others carrying the kind of hidden suffering Matthew had lived with for so long. Rick began asking the question he wished someone had asked sooner. There's no shame when a heart fails or when kidneys stop working. So why do people feel shame when the brain breaks down? He started talking about Matthew openly, calling him brave, one of the bravest people he had ever known. Matthew had kept going for 10 long years after asking his father why he couldn't just die and go to heaven. Rick read thousands of letters from people Matthew had quietly led to faith. In his journal, he wrote that in God's garden of grace, even broken trees bear fruit. It became his mantra, a way to create meaning from something that felt senseless. Matthew's life mattered even in its brokenness, maybe, especially in its brokenness. Rick forgave not just the person who sold the gun, but life itself. He didn't question God's goodness, though he admitted on CNN that he questioned God's plan. There was a difference, he explained. God was good, but not everything that happened was God's will. People make choices, and in a world with free will, devastating things can occur. If Matthew chose to end his life, Rick couldn't blame God for that. He had to accept it, find a way to survive it. Keep breathing when everything inside him said it was impossible, he called. Matthew brave, over and over brave for lasting 27 years with the weight he carried. Brave for getting up every morning. Brave for trying every new medication, every new therapy, every new day when all he felt was exhaustion. Maybe Rick was right. Maybe enduring that kind of suffering is its own kind of courage. But what people didn't see was that Rick never moved past it. How could he? You don't move past losing a child. You don't get over it. You learn to carry it, and even then, it feels like grief becomes a second heartbeat inside your chest. Rick said he cried every day after Matthew died. He didn't see that as weakness. He saw it as love. Mental health advocacy became his mission. Depression became part of his teaching, woven through sermons and devotionals, infused into interviews years later. In 2024, he was still working with California's Catholic bishops on a pastoral letter called Hope and Healing, calling it a watershed moment, a new standard for church-based mental health ministry. He repeated a message he wished the world would internalize. Your chemistry is not your character. Your illness is not your identity. He said it with the conviction of someone who hoped the words could save someone else's child. Even if they hadn't saved his by 2025, Rick was still speaking, still traveling, still teaching, presenting at the World Evangelical Alliance, gathering in Seoul, preaching at Saddleback, recording his daily hope devotionals. He talked about faith, purpose, suffering, and meaning. He and Kay continued giving away 91% of their income, living on the remaining 9%. They had 5 grandchildren. Life kept moving, but in the quiet moments, between sermons and conferences and flights, Rick Warren was still that father standing on a sidewalk in Mission Viejo, still the man who couldn't save his son, still hearing Matthew at 17 asking why he couldn't just die. The pain never left. It simply became part of who he was. And here is the heartbreaking truth most people never say out loud. Rick Warren is still grieving. Even after more than a decade, the loss hasn't faded. Time doesn't heal every wound. Some wounds settle into scars you learn to live around. Rick found the strength to hold the hands of others at their gravesides. To talk about God's garden of grace, where even broken trees bear fruit, but his own tree is still broken. It always will be. He preaches hope while carrying despair. He proclaims God's goodness while wrestling with God's plan. He helps millions find purpose while wondering privately if he could have done more to save Matthew. It's the quiet paradox of being a pastor. You give and give until you're empty. And then you give again because people need you and because the work still matters. Even when your heart is heavy, because stopping would mean admitting that maybe, just maybe, some pain has no purpose. Rick Warren's faith didn't break. That's what he tells people, what he believes. He never questioned God's existence, never doubted heaven, never stopped believing in the resurrection. Matthew's body was broken, but he is in glory now. Rick knows it in his bones. He believes he will see his son again someday, whole, healed, free from the torment that plagued him for 27 years. That belief is what keeps him going, because without it, Matthew's death would be nothing but senseless tragedy, random suffering in an indifferent universe. But the question remains, is Rick Warren really fine? He says he's changed, more empathetic, able to feel others' pain in ways he never could before. He cries easily. He connects with the broken and hurting because he is broken and hurting himself. The polished, best-selling pastor has been replaced by something raw, more human. Maybe that's growth. Maybe grace. Or maybe it's just what happens when the worst thing imaginable becomes your reality. Rick continues, his work preaching to thousands every week, traveling the world, spreading the gospel, building churches, foundations, and initiatives. But every Monday morning, he admits to waking up with what he calls post-message syndrome, wondering if someone else could do a better job, if he's smart enough, strong enough, faithful enough to lead tens of thousands. Doubt creeps in, exhaustion settles. The weight of carrying everyone else's burdens presses down while he struggles to carry his own. He tells people, God never puts more on you than you can bear, that we should help each other shoulder the load. But what happens when your burden is too heavy? When faith, medicine, prayer, and every effort still aren't enough? Rick doesn't have the answers. No one does. All he has is the choice to keep going or stop, and he keeps going. The cracks show in interviews where he chokes up mid-sentence, sermons where he has to pause, in tweets that reveal more pain than comfort. Kay stands beside him, wiping his tears while carrying her own broken heart. They are not the same people they were before April 5th, 2013. How could they be? There is no tidy ending, no moment when the pain evaporates, no sudden peace. There is only a father who lost his son, who questions God's plan while holding on to God's goodness, who preaches hope while living with heartbreak, who forgave the person who sold his son a gun because forgiveness is what you do, even when it feels impossible. Is Rick Warren fine? He carries on. But the truth is, he will never be the same.